Westward Ho. September 1941 saw the return of the junior school to Buckley, from whence it had started 2 years earlier. Those of us who reached senior school age going instead to the various homes of their respective houses. Derek Joyce, Fizzy, and I went with others to schoolhouse at Bellevue, just along the road from Buckley. Life was different in many ways, there being an intensity and keenness to proceedings which had been totally absent in the junior school. We met again old friends from Hartland days who had made the change a year earlier, Brian Whittard, Verney and others. We met new and older boys who had not enjoyed life at Hartland. The outward and visible sign of change was in the uniform. Brown-grey corduroy shorts and grey shirts were exchanged for baggy blue shorts and white shirts. There were different blazers, caps, etc., and long-trousered suits for best, which the junior school had dropped on the outbreak of war. The routine was entirely different. Now we had to move rapidly from one part to another for the ensuing lesson, whereas our classroom had never varied at Hartland and the teacher had moved round. The new routine involved almost impossible dashes, sometimes between the widest spaced points at which the classrooms were located. Derek and I were both assigned to the second form, the base classroom being in the form master's house at Ennisfarne. KRG Hunt soon let us realise how idle life had been in comparison with what was now required. At Christmas we were both promoted to the third form, as we had between us taken first and second places in every subject. So we could well find that first lesson in the morning was at Ennisfarne, the second being maths with Mr. Sorensen at Sunset, then science under Miss Heather at Twooser's garage, mostly in the attic room, and then a charge down to Beale's cafe for history, and so on. Miss Heather was a very little lady, elderly and with a pince nez. Her life was not precisely a bed of roses when dealing with us at any event. I remember how we used to try not to laugh as Eddie Brentnell tried out his latest teasing ideas. At one time he tried to convince her that he was the perpetual inebriate, and at another he wanted to know all about the uses of a mysterious item of apparatus called an Aristotle bottle. When we were taken by Mr. Bateman for physics, however, there was a genuine interest and attention, despite his easy-going manner. It was the same in English under Mr. Stevenson at Youngerton, a man we all instinctively took to, whatever our ability. Mr. Thomas, Bookie T as he was universally known, did not teach the young uns, but we met him at the bookshop from time to time, when getting our textbooks for the term. Mostly he was to be seen pedalling an ancient bicycle around, which was equipped with an archaic acetylene lamp, a museum piece even in those days. We had to flag masters in passing by bending our right arms to bring hands to shoulders. Bookie never appreciated the salutation when grinding along on his bike. If I remember correctly, Mally took us for French. Theodore Mallinson was, and perhaps still is, a fresh air and exercise fiend who superintended sports and running. Those cross-country runs always seemed to take us up some part or other of the tours. One aspect of senior life was not universally looked on with eager anticipation, though most of us were keen enough: the school corps. Commanded by Major Sorensen, assisted by Lieutenants Stevenson and Mallinson. When we arrived, the older boys, who held ranks mostly between Lance Corporal and Sergeant Major, were still kitted out in the old pre-war field service army uniform with brass buttons, a hook and eye neck collar and puttees with peaked caps. In wartime conditions, this was not surprising. We started with brass button tunics, but never had puttees and peaked caps, our headgear being the fore and aft forage cap. Later the whole corps was brought up to date with battle dress, gaiters, berets, etc. The road outside Youngerton was our parade ground, and our NCOs slowly taught us the elements of the martial arts, though we were back at Highgate before the then new battle drill began to be taught. However, we enjoyed handling military equipment, and even knowing how to drill with rifles was something one could learn with pride. Tuesday and Friday afternoons were spent in this way in part. Wednesday and Saturday afternoons were sports afternoons. By 1941 the sporting facilities were not limited solely to the recreation ground, as you say. In fact, I would have thought that the field shown on your plan to the rear of Buckley and going as far as Bellevue would throughout have been another sport ground. Certainly I remember playing soccer there in my brand new red and white house shirt that winter term and later. Our running was certainly done on the rec in the spring term, when we were issued with standard sports cards and urged on by our seniors to gain points for the house by achieving the distance times, jumping heights and so forth decreed by TGM as the pass standards at various ages. Later developing as a long-distance cross-country type. These were not entirely my métier. Of summer, cricket, etc., I remember nothing at Westward Ho. A shop which benefited greatly from our trade whenever the morning dashes between classes allowed was the baker's on Nelson Road, I think. They sold buns of a saffron yellow tint which were new and delicious. I would have thought we had a 3rd pint bottle of milk each somewhere or other in mid-morning, as we always did back at Highgate, but I cannot recollect them. We certainly had an issue of vitamin C pills. The Golden Bay Hotel Annex housed Westgate and administration. It was there that one could meet Miss Bannister, and there that one went when summoned for a routine medical exam by Herxey, Dr. Herxheimer. He taught German, which I did not take, and played hockey, which I never got involved with. A character with original views on certain aspects of medicine. He cured me of recurrent looseness of the bowels by sending me to bed for a week to live on water and 4 teacupsfuls of raw grated apple a day for 4 days, followed by days on dry toast and tea without milk or sugar, and then a slow return to a normal diet. Mrs. Bell must have found it wearing to go all the way up to my 2nd floor attic dormitory with such fare, whilst he kept me in bed. From the GBA we were issued with our very first clothing coupons. Rationing started before 1941, but came in by stages, and, indeed, it was not until well after the war that bread and flour were ineffectively rationed for a time. The original clothing coupons were an oblong sheet of what had been intended to be margarine coupons, printed in a khaki green on a yellowish card which folded into 3. One's name, address and national registration number were written at the top. My number up to the time I went into the army was WHEA 13/17, and all the original Hartland contingent had consecutive numbers in the system. I think it was the Lambourne brothers who first kept rabbits at Bellevue, but I and several others soon joined in. The rabbitry was a brick and tile shed in the front garden, wherein we constructed our cages. The rabbits were all registered at a corn merchant's in Bideford, so that we could buy their monthly ration of bran. Apart from that, they lived on whatever greenery the kitchen, the garden and the countryside could provide. The rabbits travelled between London and Westward Ho in boxes with handles, which we made especially for the purpose. For much of the journey, rabbits were to be seen hopping up and down the train's corridors and in and out of the compartments. I kept rabbits for quite a time after our return to London, my stock coming from Mrs. Hill, the wife of Professor A.V. Hill, who lived further along Bishopswood Road. The Professor, an elderly man, even in 1943-7, was more often than not up before we were in the mornings and to be seen running round Senior Field. The object of these rabbit-keeping operations was mainly to raise offspring for sale to butchers within the broad aegis of the National Dig for Victory campaign run by the Ministry of Food. I also cultivated an allotment at Bellevue without much success. The school holidays prevented the regular attendance necessary at critical times in the planting and harvesting cycle. Among my dormitory prefects in these early days, I recall John Fuller and L.L. Lulu Buck. Lulu had an apparently endless line in the sort of stories that one mainly didn't tell to one's parents. A sample I partially remember is so much in the Cyril Fletcher vein that I asked him whether it had originated with him. One evening when we sat next to one another at a round table dinner, 7 or 8 years ago. He denied paternity. It was about an engine driver. Another was, "They're shifting Grandpa's grave to build a sewer. They're shifting it regardless of expense. Now Grandpa in his lifetime weren't a quitter, and I don't suppose he'll be a quitter now." A strong flavour, this one, of social history, probably based on an early compulsory purchase order, probably Cockney in origin, and quite possibly relating to the building of what became known as the West Kent Main Sewer in about 1870. Rather sad and whimsical. I must ask Lulu sometime whether he can remember the rest of it. On promotion to the senior school, we were introduced to punishment by penal copy. I wonder if the system is still in use. PCs dished out by masters were tolerable, but I think we all felt that the monitors and prefects were a trifle inconsistent in their punishments, and that a penny a time could be a lot to pay for something which hardly warranted correction. One also had to watch that the cumulative total in GFB's book had not reached the point where one was due to pay all over again through an enforced introduction to GFB's cane. Amongst our indoor entertainment at Bellevue were a radio, a record player, and a quarter-size billiards table. Here I heard Churchill's chicken speech referred to earlier. The only record I can remember was Eric Winstone's Stagecoach, played over and over again. chief classical music fan was Blear Guy Barnett, who used on occasion to get very annoyed when the majority insisted that the radio be turned over to some other programme. Tommy Handley and Itmar were favourites. One hardly noticed how the earnestness of the war crept inexorably on by slow but steady stages. It was autumn 1941, when we were introduced to the horrors of potato picking. We spent a cheerless day gathering them in buckets and filling sacks. Whilst we were paid, my impression is that the farmer hardly got value for money. Our later efforts were, I think, all at summer harvest camps, of which more later. There was one fixture in the routine at Bellevue which everyone had to go through. This was the Pate's talk on a man-to-man basis about the facts of life. I can recollect that we always cross-questioned anyone who had been into his sanctum for this session, and were always disappointed that they wouldn't pass on anything they'd learned, putting this down to shyness on their part. In fact, when my turn came, I entered the room with embarrassment. I do not now recall what GFB had to say, but it became clear that the reason why people gave nil reports was simply that there was nothing in the talk in the least bit spicy. Looking back, it is a little hard to see why we thought there would be. After all, GFB was not trying to give us a quick biology lesson, but to deal in moral and religious aspects of a subject that always has and presumably always will cause debate so far as teaching is concerned. A set piece in the school calendar just before the end of the Christmas term every year was the house supper. Even on first acquaintance, I found these to be more often than not a matter of embarrassment in terms of the entertainment afterwards. Those with musical or singing skills could entertain, and those interested in the Amateur Dramatic Society, like Chris Morahan, were entertaining. But for the rest of us, the near-compulsory concoction of a dormitory act was horrible. I'm sure that Mr. and Mrs. Bell would have gladly done away with the ritual had they thought it possible to do so. Chris later crowned a successful career in the ADS back at Highgate with memorable performances in Doctor's Dilemma, Journey's End and St. Joan. Whereas we had played happily over Pebble Ridge in 1940, the whole area was shut off at this stage of the war. There had been mining to prevent potential landings, and the army had taken over the beach for use as a training ground for DUKWs. Most of the traffic in the place was army traffic, but strangely I can recall just about nothing to do with them. The road from Sunset up the hill to Bellevue led past the buildings of what once had been a public school, Imperial Services College. We did not take over any of their buildings, so presumably they were in use for some very good purpose that I've often thought it a little odd that the school was not able to lay its hands on what was, after all, purpose-built accommodation, and presumably capable of use for our purposes with a minimum of adaptation. Until I read your book, I had quite forgotten that Mrs. Jack was the S.H. caterer at this time. There were a number of mothers living in rented houses and bungalows in the area. I often used to be invited by Mrs. Boreham to go along to tea with Mike. He was not in S.H., but my Hartland friendship with him has lasted to this day. I have to confess, strangely, that I cannot recall anything else at present which it would be useful to write down, and am slightly puzzled why my memories of Westward Ho are so scanty. Perhaps they may help you, and perhaps the recollections of other people will be more copious.